So you first, me first.
I think we're just going.
Okay. I guess it's my favorite time of year. The TDR pages are done.
TDR season.
Everything's been finally submitted. Everything's been finally done, and everything's like being proofread, printed, all that good stuff. So how did you feel about your TDR pages this year? What did you like? What did you not like?
I always enjoy getting to look back over the year. It's tricky. Things change so quickly. Sometimes it feels almost like ancient history, having to look all the way back to like January or
all
February.
Those tickets from then.
Right,
yeah.
And how things have changed over the course of the year. But it's really nice, especially from an Intel perspective, because it gives us so much to look at, so much good, meat to dig into as far as looking at trends and different clusters and how they've changed. So I think that's my favorite part.
The weird thing for me looking through it is the entire thing of like where there are spikes, like flows and ebbs at different points of the year, where I think, oh yeah, we saw a lot of that between January and March. Whatever happened to that? Different things like that. But the volume that we saw was enough that would still show up on the report. Little things like that, or the things that were like the new hotness, like a file format that bad guys started using, or vulnerabilities or different stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to me to go back and have that kind of trip through time of what were we doing at this point, like 8 months ago, that sort of stuff.
It is, and I think it helps because, we have all our biases we have to watch out for in cybersecurity, and recency bias is very real. And so there'll be something where there's a lot of activity, especially maybe the latter half of the year, like Darkgate, for example.
Yeah.
We saw so much Darkgate. It's not in our top 10 because overall, it just wasn't as active over the course of the year as some of the other threats that we have seen.
So talk about Darkgate a little bit, since I know Darkgate is one of those malware families that tends to lean itself into initial access sort of things. I know one of the sections that we do have on the TDR this year is the initial access trends.
We do.
Stuff that we
initial
have
access
there.
trends.
What did you enjoy from that?
Initial access trends are always really, it's really fun to write, but it's tricky. And some of that is because it changes so much. And at the same time, it doesn't change.
Yep.
So the theme, I think, for initial access this year is very much like last verse, same as the first, a little bit louder, a little bit worse. It's still phishing.
Yeah.
It's still different kinds. We've got more common use of things like QR codes and phishing emails. There's been some Teams phishing. So phishing is still, I think, very much the favorite initial access vector. There's SEO and malvertising, which is still super active this year. And we saw, I think, across the industry, a lot more use of vulnerabilities for initial access. And I know that I think that's going to come up a lot because there was such an increased use of vulnerability exploitation.
I love mentioning like the search engine optimization stuff, because it's something that I've ended up looking for a lot more with incidents now is when certain malware families will pop up. I'm automatically asking some of our threat hunters, customers, other people, did the user happen to Google for this software on the search engine? Did they happen to go look for cracked software? Did they happen to go do something like that? Because it seems like we've seen so much of that with Stealer distribution, with different forms of malware. Like it seems like in years gone by, we would see a lot of the macro stuff, a lot of like Office macros, a lot of things like that. And then as in the last year and a half, things have kind of gotten more diversified as people experimented a little bit more.
They did. We had OneNote exploitation at the very beginning of the year. TA577 had a big OneNote campaign, and TA570 did too, distributing QBot and leveraging OneNote since their favorite mark of the web bypasses
had work at that point.
They had been like, all of those had been kind of, they had gotten better at patching those issues.
Yes.
And so a lot of their favorite sort of techniques weren't in use. They tried OneNote. It worked great for a little while. That got patched. So that activity kind of tapered off. But still, it was really interesting to see. And then you did some looking at MSIX.
That was always interesting because I've come to kind of talking to people a lot about comparing malware with installers, and not necessarily that installers are malicious in any sense necessarily. It's just that when people go searching for software, when people go looking for their Photoshop binaries, when they go looking for different stuff like that on Google, they have that innate trust in whatever they're downloading. They have that, like, of course, this is exactly what it says it is. Why wouldn't it be? That sort of mindset. And we've kind of gotten used to seeing some of the different installer formats and analyzing those from the malware analysis perspective. Like, I'll look at MSI installers or executable installers on pretty much a weekly basis. And then some adversaries started using different installer formats like that MSIX, which is supposedly, I guess, like the new next generation sort of MSI based installer. Some malware analysis tools kind of croaked on it a little bit, trying to figure out, can we read it correctly? Can we execute it in sandboxes right? And it was interesting to kind of see that trend really kind of come to a head towards October, November-ish. And it's still around. It's just not as published as it was at that point. It's not necessarily as big of a head that came up at that point. And I know something that also ended up popping up around about the November side was some more, well, I say November side. It seemed like every month there was a different vulnerability. There was a different sort of thing where I know earlier in the year we had the progress software, like the Move It incidents that were the big thing.
Notable.
It seemed like anybody that uses a managed file transfer solution has had a problem with this at some point in recent years. On towards the end of the year, there was the Confluence stuff. There was like 2 or 3 notable vulnerabilities with Confluence where one of them led to ransomware deployment. And that was something that I know you had near and dear to your heart, talking about dwell time a little bit, because I remember with the Confluence, with one particular campaign where Confluence exploitation led to deploying ransomware, there wasn't really a dwell time at all. So I know you had lots of feelings about this.
Well, it's surprising. It's surprising that when it comes to things like ransomware in particular, the dwell time keeps getting shorter and shorter. I haven't been in cybersecurity as long as some other folks have been in the industry. And even since I have started in the last 5 years, the dwell time has gone from being actual time to no time, practically. It'll be really interesting to see as some other folks that observed a little bit more in their environments, like do some FAY reporting and start talking about the dwell time that they saw to see kind of what the average was across the industry. It'll be very interesting to see, because fortunately, we didn't see that much active ransomware. We saw some precursors, which is still the key, and we have a few common ransomware precursors in our top 10. And so that's still something that we see a lot of, and tracking that initial access activity, this precursor activity, is really, really important. But that activity is also, it's so fast. It's so fast. You get something like when Qbot was still active, and why it was such a popular pre-ransomware tool is because it did so much automatically. So it could do automatic recon. It would start setting up C2 communication, and it would be, I don't know how long. I saw some examples.
I remember like CrowdStrike reporting from several years ago, where kind of like the commonly accepted thing was a day and a half, 2 days, where an adversary would have initial access and then start doing lateral movement, and then maybe a dwell time of like a few days after that. And what really hit me in the last couple of years was that how much it changes per adversary.
It does.
Like, especially with ransomware stuff, because with ransomware, it's one of our other colleagues, Christina, she actually referred to this yesterday as like a franchise model sort of thing, where it's, you have lockbit ransomware, you have all these ransomware companies almost. And then you have the different affiliates. Well, just like your franchises of different restaurants, you know, one restaurant over here may serve food faster than the other. Well, this affiliate goes to ransomware faster than the other, different things like that. Or if, you know, that entire chain goes out of business, that franchisee still needs a job. They go somewhere else. They find somewhere else. And it's the same thing with affiliates. So like as QBot and the others started kind of going downhill, we saw some of the affiliates that were distributing QBot going to other malware families.
Yes, after the takedown in August, which was very exciting for everybody. But yes, they did start using some. The ransomware ecosystem is so well established at this point. You know, it's not like the initial access brokers are going to just find something else to do completely. They're just going to put a new tool in place of the tool that they were using before. One thing that is interesting, since you have these different families and these different groups, it not only changes dwell time, it also changes the other aspects of ransomware cases. And so it'll change whether there's going to be a higher likelihood of encryption or not. Some ransomware groups don't encrypt anymore. They'll
the
just
extortion stuff.
They'll just steal your data and extort it, and maybe encrypt and have that kind of hanging over people's heads as an additional incentive to cooperate with them. But it's not necessarily the truth that every ransomware event there's encryption. Sometimes it's just extortion that happens, which is interesting. And it also changes kind of, I think, the experience of working with and communicating with the teams as well. And it's interesting how the different families can be very, very different kind of experiences. And it's not just like there is ransomware. It always goes like this. It's going to be this amount of dwell time. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what the process is going to be like.
And because like they change enough, because they differ enough with the different playbooks, there's enough like precursor behaviors, like enough like discovery, reconnaissance activity that it's enough that we can sort of dial in on this before we ultimately get to the ransomware side. That's the amazing part to me. Talk about like changing a little bit of tact from the ransomware side. Something I know in the last few years that we've kind of had a really big push towards in TDR and other reporting is taking in a lot more data beyond endpoint things, beyond the malware stuff that's on endpoints. And I know last year we started incorporating more identity type things.
We did, which was very exciting.
Yeah, and it's kind of in some ways it's a whole new world, but identity itself, like identities themselves, are as old as computer systems to me, because as long as you've been around the computer systems, need to know who you are. It's just, it seems like they're being used in different ways. The products that they're being used with are a little bit different. So in what we've seen over the last year, what we've sort of seen more with identity type stuff has been a lot of scenarios where adversaries will acquire identities, use those towards cloud applications, use those towards SaaS applications in particular. Maybe an organization uses Microsoft Entra for authentication. Maybe they use SharePoint Online, Office 365, all these different tools. And I've always kind of wondered, like, I remember seeing on the MITRE ATT&CK framework where there was like this valid credentials technique. And I was thinking, why, like, where does that even play into any of it at some point, like several years back? And the more I see the identity stuff, the more I realize that all of that valid credential stuff is fueled by this identity stuff.
It is. The attack surface has changed a lot, and the threat landscape has changed a lot because of that.
What I've kind of noticed talking in the last year to a few different customers, some big, some small, some sophisticated, some not, like, it seems like everybody, or I don't want to say everybody, a significant portion of folks get really worried about certain malware families. Like, some organizations are intensely worried about ransomware. What some of the more like cloud organized, like large cloud adopting organizations get worried about is stealers. like specifically Stealer malware.
And you did the Stealer section for the TDR this year.
It was kind of an interesting update from the previous year, because the malware family, the malware category itself, is still the same as it ever was. Just a little bit of things changed here and there.
What are some of the things that did change over the year?
So I think we saw more macOS kind of activity with Stealers over the year. So probably one of the more prevalent malware families we saw doing stealing activities on Mac was Atomic Stealer this year. That was distributed in a load of different ways. It was distributed in mostly like those fake installers where people would go search on Google, try to find Notion or Evernote or something like that, go download it and end up realizing that they didn't exactly get what they came for.
Fake installers and fake updates were very popular this year.
It's the common way in of like, people are so trained to say, oh, I just need to double click and go forward. I just need to get this error message out of my way so I can go and do my day. And we've conditioned people so much to some of that it's really an easy way in for some adversaries. The other big thing that kind of came up with Stealers this year was on towards the end of the year, there was a big deal with Google OAuth sessions where you could take cookies, you could take tokens out of browsers and potentially revive old Google OAuth sessions, things like that. And it was kind of fascinating to me to watch that because you got to see how fast Stealers adopted that. Like we kind of talk about like in legitimate industry, like there are innovators, there are different sort of things where all sorts of things get adopted over time. Sometimes it's really fast, sometimes it's really slow. In the Stealer market, like this black market malware arena, it went from like 0 to 60 instantly. It went from like November from I think it was like either October or November into December. It started with one family and then like 5 or 6 more adopted it by the end of the year. It was kind of a crazy thing of how fast it was. But some of that speed was probably because at the same time, not much changed in the Stealer malware that let them do it. It was almost like vulnerability research for them on the Stealer side because they got to realize how they collected their data. They could get more information out of the data they were collecting from people's browsers already. And that was kind of interesting to talk through with customers because we did have some people ask, what about this Google OAuth thing? You know, are Stealers any different going towards that? And in reality, it's the same data that's being taken off the endpoint and the same data they're already taking is just being used in a new weird way. So that was kind of interesting to read through alongside the Mac stuff.
Hearing from customers as recently as just a few days ago, talking about what a challenge it is now that it's so common for people to be moving into the cloud. It's going to be a bigger issue just because it's going to be in use more. And as we've talked about, as things become more commonly used, adversaries are excited to see how they can exploit these new opportunities.
It strikes me like, I remember when organizations started using like Dropbox and Box and like some of those cloud storage solutions, and people would get like these policies out of like, you must not use these because we can't control all the data that's in them. And organizations have kind of gotten smarter to some of that now, have more of a systematic approach of you can use this, but not that. You can, we have this properly secured. We know all the policies for this, but maybe not that. And something I've talked with some organizations about is like hearing that some organizations not only just use one cloud solution, they'll end up using multiple cloud solutions. Maybe they have some things in Azure, some things in AWS, some things where they have a storage solution in Dropbox and all sorts of different applications, different solutions. And it's so hard to do that inventory, do that scoping of data that you have. Like for the longest time, people struggle to or they still struggle to have an accurate count of computers and network devices.
Yes.
And those are concrete items. That's solid things. Like data is abstract. It's ephemeral sort of thing. Like how do you figure out what do you have in different areas? And like adversaries will absolutely take advantage of this.
They will.
Like the whole thing with kind of tying it in from identities into this, as we've kind of gotten towards the more remote work, more people distributed, yeah, the data is in more places, but identities could be used in more places. Like we can get one user's credentials from a stealer that's, sent a log somewhere and turn that credential around and immediately have access to their email account or all this different stuff. Whereas previously you could cut some of that off at a firewall. Maybe you could, lock that user in Active Directory. It's kind of a more complex, bigger scoped world now.
It is very much so. And I know it's outside of Red Canary's scope, but also makes incident response so much more challenging.
Yes.
Like it just unbelievably challenging, because then you have questions of like data privacy on the systems and log access.
Regulated data.
Yeah. And so this is an area that's I know it's going to expand. These questions are going to come up. Hopefully, we've got really good people like our folks here at Red Canary working on solutions to help monitor and track and protect customers and their data as the threat environments change, as the threats change, as the threat landscape changes.
So that works. I've only got one additional question. Are you ready for next year's TDR?
Oh gosh, no. No, not yet. Not yet. But I'm really excited to see. We've already had some things start this year. It'll be interesting to see how the year progresses. We're already a little ways into the year. And as we talked about, sometimes things at the beginning of the year end up having a surprisingly big impact over the course of the year.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's like the big inciting event at the beginning of a novel. You don't really know how the rest of the year is going to go. But hey, we're going to have a good journey along the way. Off in the distance.
Reminds me of Lord of the Rings. Have you watched that movie?
Yes.
When Pippin dropped that skeleton.
Oh yeah, down the well.
I'm just like another.
are you excited for Threat Sounds?
That sounds.
Threat Sounds.
Oh, the playlist.
Threat Sounds Volume 4.
Yes.